Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nick Agopian. I work for a company called RenewAire here in wonderful Madison, Wisconsin. I'm very honored and pleased to talk to you about energy recovery ventilation, what's new, and then more importantly, how can we justify more mechanical ventilation? Why, how, and what's next, especially in this new world order called the COVID world. What I'd like to do before I start is maybe introduce some new concepts and some new thoughts or a couple of fun topics that probably you didn't know about. Because as we move through this presentation, you'll be pleasantly surprised and shockingly surprised at some of the data that I'm going to present. But all of the data comes from empirical research and peer-reviewed papers. So if you're interested in the data and the more macro aspect of the research, please reach out to me offline. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it in more detail, but then more importantly, send you all of this information. If we take a look at a city center, we have lots of cars, and there's a lot of traffic in these main metropolitan areas. New York, Chicago, Boston, lots of traffic, that's for sure. What if I was to tell you that 40% of the cars in these major metropolitan areas are simply looking for parking spots? So these concepts of community cars or shared vehicles actually will help in lowering the amount of traffic within these spaces in city centers. Another thing is we think that the oxygen from the rainforest is what we breathe. In actuality, it's not. What if I was to tell you that all the oxygen in the rainforest is consumed by the animals within the rainforest? Actually, what occurs is the trees suck up the water, it goes up the trees, it ends up in the leaves, it leaves the leaves, and it ends up into the jet streams as moisture and humidity. It travels over to the Andes, it hits the Andes, and then it rains. And this water trickles down over the rocks, it picks up nutrients and ends up in the water. And there are these little microscopic, we can call them animals or whatever it is we want to call it, but aqualife that consume these nutrients from the water that trickle down from the rain, that stemmed from the rainforest. And these little things are called diatoms. And these diatoms are what produce the oxygen that we all breathe around the world. So IAQ ventilation in perspective. Something that we didn't realize is that when we take a look at structures about 100 years ago, we used about 50 different materials to produce, manufacture, or construct the house in question. However, 100 years later, which is quite surprising, is that we now use about 55,000 materials to build a home or to build a building, an office building, a restaurant, or whatever it may be. So products of construction definitely contribute to deficient indoor air quality or the off-gassing of those materials. What's interesting is that these materials will off-gas for up to 25 years after they've been used in the construction process. A little bit of trivia. We consume about 4 pounds of water. We consume about 4 pounds of food. What's interesting is that we consume about 31 pounds of air. Now, what's interesting is when we take a look at a water bottle, we have an expiry date. That puzzles me because water has been around for billions and billions of years. It came on a meteor and it's like energy and it stays and it sticks. You can convert it to a vapor, you can convert it into a solid, but at the end of the day, it's the same water. It's essentially dinosaur pee. We have expiry dates on food. We know that if you go to a buffet, pre-COVID times, you used to be able to go and serve yourself food, but after 20 minutes or so, they take that food away because it's considered expired. So we have all these regulations in place on what we consume, but we have no regulations in place on what we breathe. And our digestion process is quite advanced because as we move through the last billions of years, we've changed how we consume food and how we use water. But when it comes to our respiratory, that hasn't evolved much. And it's still the same respiratory system without many changes. But yet we consume and we bring in more air than through our noses than we do through our mouths. Interesting numbers, 79, 70, and 89. Our average life is about 79 years, from infancy to elderly. We spend 20 years in buildings, that's office buildings, that's gyms, that's restaurants, even consider transiting in cars. And we spend about 50 years in our homes. So that's a total of almost 90% of our lifetime inside spaces as compared to being outside. When we take a look at the elderly, they spend up to 95% of their time indoors. And when we take a look at children, they spend 95+% of their time indoors. And we know, based on the research from the EPA, that the indoor air is 2 to 5 times, up to 100 times more polluted than outdoor air. Personally, in my opinion, indoor air is more likely to be 10 times to more like 15 or 20 times more polluted than outdoor air, because the research looks at construction materials. But when we take into consideration the activities we have in the space, especially during this COVID time, we realize that the contaminants that we have inside the space, when we're using ammonias and chlorines to clean surfaces, actually offers extremely bad deficient indoor air quality. But ventilation has been around for years. Even early humans, they realized that they can generate fire and they can cook food or they can stay warm. And then they realized they can bring it indoors into their caves, but without proper ventilation, they would get too much smoke. So with ventilation, they're able to bring fire indoors. The Egyptian stone carvers realized that they're more efficient in carving stone outside of the pyramids and moving those stone carvings inside than actually trying to carve inside. We knew in the Middle Ages that diseases were dropped when we opened windows. We even knew back in 1775, based on that research, that CO2 was a concern and was a bioeffluent. So ventilation has been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, but it's only since 1825 that we realized that we have to bring ventilation back up. And then we brought ventilation back down because of the oil embargo, for those of you that remember the 80s. And now we're reconsidering how much ventilation we bring within spaces because of not only flushing out contaminants, not only for indoor air quality, but for health and safety. So why do we ventilate? Most of the time we'll hear people say moisture and mold, and we have an odor, like an odor, we smell something. Once in a while, we'll hear people be a little bit more sophisticated and they'll say carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and radon. But we rarely hear people talking about nitrogen dioxide, formaldehyde, ozone, and especially PM 2.5, which I'll touch on. But what happens now is if we take a look at a simple thing like TVOCs, total volatile organic compounds, as compared to SVOCs, which is semi-volatile organic compounds. Think about paint, I don't know, 15 years ago. You used to paint a room, and for about 2-3 days, you couldn't go into the room because it smelled poorly, so you had to leave the window open. And then you used to go in after about 2 days, and everything is okay. Well, we didn't like that because we're impatient. We live in a very impatient society today. So we developed these water-based paints that don't smell, and we think it's because of the water. What we have inside those paints now are the SVOCs, which is the semi-volatile organic compounds. So you don't necessarily smell them, but they're definitely there. And the problem is when, back with TVOCs, when you had them there for about 2-3 days and then they were gone, now we have SVOCs that you don't smell because it's below the threshold limit of your nose, but it's there now for 25 years. So what's better, the SVOCs or the TVOCs? My opinion, the TVOCs, but at the end of the day, we now have to live with SVOCs. And we come to PM 2.5. We used to think that the problem with deficient indoor air quality is the macro environment. It's the stuff that we can see and the dusts and so on and so forth. In actuality, it's the nano environment. It's the micro environment. It's the stuff you can't see. PM 2.5, if you take a look at this strand of hair, PM 2.5 is the red dot on the blue dot. The red dot is PM 10. That's particle matter 10 micron. That's usually filtered out through a MERV8 filter. However, PM 2.5 is 2.5 micron. That typically requires a MERV13 filter. Now, why is that important? And why is that a consideration today? And you can see what it looks like here in the bottom with the electron scan microscope pictures. We now know, through the Institute of Medicine, that we breathe into PM 2.5. It ends up in our lungs because it bypasses our primary filtration in our nose. So we breathe it in. When we breathe it in, it ends up in our lungs. And as we move, stand up, sit down, go up and down stairs, or walk, or even exercise, it moves through tissue and ends up in our bloodstream and reacts in our bloodstream like triglycerides. And it's deemed a contributor to heart attacks and strokes. Now, think about waking up at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning, and the sun just happens to be coming in at the right angle. The stuff that's floating in the air where you see the sun ray, that's PM 2.5. It moves in the Brownian movement. It stays floating in the air and right around the breathing zone. So it's definitely there unless you have MERV 13 or better filtration within your home or your offices. But in places like California under Title 24, now they deemed it by code mandatory to have PM 2.5 when you're a certain distance from a highway. Think about these 12-lane highways and 16-lane highways they have in California. What are the two biggest consumables in these cars? Tires and brakes. Where do they go? They end up in the air. They end up as PM 2.5. They don't end up in the stratosphere. They stay around where we live. So PM 2.5 is a very critical consideration. And even worse is PM1, and that's even being analyzed or researched on the detrimental effects it has as it enters through our ocular vein and ends up in our brain. And it's suspect for Alzheimer's, but we'll see what happens with that research. And we talk about activity within the space. If I was to ask everybody, what is in your laundry detergent, in your washer and dryer needs, and what's in those softening sheets that you throw into the dryer? Nobody knows because it's an unregulated industry. We have no idea. But what I can tell you, if you like hunting or if you have a mosquito problem in your backyard, take 2 of those dryer sheets and put them on each side of your belt and walk outside. I guarantee you, you won't have any flies or mosquitoes. The reason is because they know to stay away from that stuff because of the amount of toxic material that are in those sheets, believe it or not. But Dr. Colbert ran some research, and what he found is that coming out of your laundry room are 25 volatile organic combinations, which include 7 hazardous pollutants. 2 of them, acetaldehyde and benzene, are grouped as carcinogens by the EPA. What's interesting when he did his calculations and published his research from Seattle, Washington, he found that 6% of the acetaldehyde and benzene coming out of vehicular emissions in all of Seattle, Washington, is what we would expect to have indoors in all of the laundry rooms within Seattle, Washington. It's kind of like saying when you're washing and drying, take 6% of your exhaust of those compounds and just dump it into your house. So we see that activity is very critical within these spaces. And we can't do anything about activity. We need to live indoors. We know that we have to seal these structures so that they're super tight and we don't have uncontrolled exchange of air, which of course is energy with the outdoors. So now they're sealed indoors. We can't stop people from living their lives. So there's only one thing we can do, and that's ventilate. And now we come to the COVID world, and we can look at these links at another time. But when we look at all the cognizant authorities, whether it's from Europe at Rehab or with ASHRAE or the CDC or any cognizant authority you look at, ventilation is foundational in the control of the spread of the disease. And the reason for that is with ventilation, you are lowering the concentration of the SARS virus within the space. If anyone thinks that they haven't been exposed to the SARS virus, as absolutely delusional. I guarantee you, you've been exposed to it, but it's been at too low of a concentration and your body has been able to fight it off. For example, if it ended up in your throat and you took a sip of coffee, it washes it down to your stomach and it renders it ineffective. Or if it's at a low enough concentration, it's not enough to actually have you contract the disease, which is COVID-19. So ventilation displaces that air, lowers the concentration, and then of course lowers your exposure limit, which lowers infection rates. So ventilation is paramount on the control of the spread and infection. So how successful have we been? When we take a look at this one little example here where we've got natural ventilation, meaning opening the windows, the CO2 in the school was 1200 ppm. We had mechanical ventilation with no AC, and it became 1,000 ppm. The second we throw in air conditioning, we feel we need to shut out the outdoor air. And what happens at that point, the CO2 concentration goes up to 2,300 ppm. If we consider CO2 as a surrogate, which we'll discuss in a second because it's actually a contaminant of concern, but when we look at it as a surrogate, then we know that if the CO2 is not being diluted, then the indoor contaminants aren't being diluted, which means we are living with them. And even though we don't smell them, sometimes we smell them, sometimes we don't smell them, but even though we don't smell them, they're still there and they have an adverse effect to the physiological operation of the human body. We have a dissonance where we think that the nose knows, but the nose does not know. Because if we don't smell it, we don't see it, we don't touch it, we don't think it's there, but it actually is there. So when we take a look at ventilation, we need to understand, is there an effect in controlling internally generated contaminants when we have ventilation? And what we find from this research, and this happens to be a house where you had the baseline with no ventilation, and you had number 5 here with an ERV, which is balanced ventilation. And the best way to maintain the lowest steady state concentration of all of these different types of chemicals and gases that we typically find inside spaces or the built environment is with balanced ventilation, meaning displacement, which offers dilution. You take 1 cubic foot of air, you throw it out, you bring fresh, clean air, and you bring it in. And then that lowers concentration. Even the Institute of Medicine said, what happens when we increase the air change rate from this point here down to this point here, which is doubling the ventilation rate? And while doubling the ventilation rate, you more than half the concentration of everything, whether it's a gas or whether it's a particulate or whether it's a virus. So we talked about CO2 a second ago. Is CO2 a surrogate or contaminant of concern? And we now know from research that came from NASA that CO2 is a contaminant of concern. We had problems associated to astronaut performance based on elevated CO2. They were making mistakes, and last thing you want to do is make a mistake on the space shuttle or the space station. And what they find is that as CO2 concentrations elevate within the space, they elevate within your lungs. As they elevate within your lungs, your oxygen content goes down within your blood. Then your brain says, I'm not getting enough blood. And as a primary organ, it dilates the vessels in your brain. And then it pushes against the skull and pushes against the brain. You experience nausea, fatigue, headache, dizziness, but these are all reversible, meaning that the second you go outside, the CO2 concentration lowers because the steady state concentration outside is in the range of about, I think, 432, 440 ppm. Then everything goes back to normal. You're no longer dizzy, you don't have nausea, you don't have a headache, and so on and so forth. However, there's other issues. CO2 is an acid, and you have something called a respiratory acidosis. And it increases the acidity of your blood, and that attacks bone marrow. That's irreversible, unlike where the latter was reversible. So we know CO2 has detrimental effects, and Lawrence Berkeley took that information and conducted some research to try to understand, is there something that's happening here on Earth? And what they found is that there is surely cognitive decline with elevated CO2 concentrations, not elevated to 5,000 ppm or 3,000 ppm or 2,000 ppm, elevated to 1,500 ppm. Typically in schools, we have up to 2,500 ppm. Sometimes when we sleep in the bedrooms, we have up to 3,500 ppm. And we know that the CO2 you sleep in, from the research, we know that CO2 you sleep in impacts the performance of the coming day. And all of the research shows that no matter what you're doing, you lower cognitive function by increasing CO2 concentration. You can get up to 12% higher SAT scores in classes, in schools, by lowering CO2 concentration. So we know that CO2 is something that we should be concerned about. So what do we do about it? And when we take a look at some of the stuff that's happening in the standards work, such as ASHRAE committees, I need you all to understand that when you see a table that says ventilation, it's not just a table where somebody said, just bring in this amount of outdoor air and you're going to be good to go. We're trying to understand what exactly is happening to chemicals inside when we don't bring in that outdoor air and the concentration elevates. We're trying to understand how we bring it in, whether it's ocular exposure, dermal exposure, inhalation, through the olfactory bulb, down through the nerve, into the brain, or into the blood circulation, into the brain. We're trying to understand the physiological operation of the human body. Ventilation has a severe impact on how we experience space inside the built environment. It's kind of like, imagine going into a garage where there's a lot of heavy oils and stuff. It's not a fun place to be at. You certainly can't concentrate. There's an effect, there's an impact. Or think about burning bacon or burning something inside your kitchen. It's an unpleasant exposure. Of course, that's very immediate. That's very obvious. The problem is when it's not immediate and it's not obvious, and the impact that you have on the physiological operation of the human body and brain activity when you're not realizing that's actually happening to you. It's kind of like boiling a frog. That's what we're doing inside these spaces to us. Another thing we look at is DALY, which is Disability Adjusted Life Year. It was funded by the Gates Foundation, took millions and millions of dollars and years and years and years. And what we find is that we have a healthy life, we have an incident. We have another healthy span of healthy life, we have another incident. You notice that this gray area where we have the healthy life gets shorter and shorter and shorter. We live with disability, and then we die young. Very depressing. We know that there's more hospital visits today than as much as early as just 10 years ago or 15 years ago. More and more people have asthma. More and more children have asthma, and that's because of the environment that we're in. So what exactly is DALY, and what does that really mean to you? Well, what they looked at is 75 different items. Things like high blood pressure, tobacco use, alcohol use, low diet in fruits, high body mass index, goes on and on and on. 2 of the top 10 reasons are because of deficient indoor air quality. We see from this graph here on the right that PM 2.5, radon, formaldehyde, acrolein, ammonia, acetaldehyde, all these gases we talked about earlier that are in the home, lower your potential of lifespan because of the nano impacts over your life. And Lawrence Berkeley said, how can I mathematically calculate this? And what they looked at is base case infiltration only, you have 160 DALY lost years. Balanced mechanical filtration is 70 DALY lost years. What this is telling us from this research is that if we live our lives in a space that's got balanced ventilation or even increased ventilation above code, because ladies and gentlemen, let's make one thing clear. Code is the minimum standard. It's the minimum somebody has to do in order so they don't go to jail. Nothing says you can't do more. It's okay to do more. It's called a higher standard. It's a better standard. And we know from this, we can increase our lifespan and live a healthier life with balanced ventilation, and even better with increased ventilation. From the research from LBNL, they said overall, the number of reported statistically significant improvements in health with increased ventilation rates far exceeded the anticipated chance of improvements in health. Meaning that if you were just to simply be in a space that's well ventilated and lowering the exposure of these contaminants that your nose doesn't know is there, that means your brain doesn't know is there. You know that PM 2.5 you can't see unless the sun's coming in. So by lowering all that stuff, your chance of being healthier with ventilation is better than you doing other things like walking or taking pills or doing any of these other things that you think are going to make you healthier. Ventilation is part of our life. It is part of living our life, and it's part of extending our life. It's not just a number that's in a table because it's in standard 62.1 or in standard 62.2 from ASHRAE and code. So please consider ventilation a lot more than just simply that. When we look at ventilation in the United States, which is the red line, the vertical red line we have here, and we look at all other European countries, including Canada, we realize that we are among the lowest out there. We try to consider ourselves the best, but yet this is how we treat our people. We have to reconsider what we're doing inside these spaces, because previously, when we didn't seal these structures as tight as we did, we didn't have 20 CFM per person or 15 CFM per person. We were like 60 CFM per person with the amount of infiltration that that structure experienced. Now, with construction technology and methodology as advanced as it is, we're back down, stuck to 5 CFM and 7.5 CFM per person. It's just not enough. When we take a look at the economics behind it, if we say, okay, let's forget about offering somebody a better life, even if we just take a look at businesses and productivity, Harvard conducted some research. And what they found is that doubling the amount of air for a single individual will cost anywhere between $10 to $40 a year. The equivalent productivity out of that individual is equal to $6,500, which means that for a business owner, if you give me anywhere between $10 to $40, I'll give you back $6,500. Where can you find that kind of a return anywhere? But then more importantly, we can lower the amount of illnesses, because the annual savings in the United States alone is equal to $58 billion if we can improve indoor air quality. Worker performance decline with deficient indoor air quality is an additional $200 billion. You know, it's the kind of thing where, think about the 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you're feeling sluggish, you think that you didn't sleep at night, or you didn't sleep well, you need to get a cup of coffee. 5 o'clock comes around, you go outside, you get a call from a friend, and a friend says, hey, you want to go do a spin class? And suddenly, just from walking outside, you're like, yeah, I've got the energy for that. What happened from dragging your behind at 3 p.m. in the afternoon to I can go do an aggressive spin class at 5 p.m.? And it all has to do with the indoor environment that you're exposing your body to. There is a direct cause and effect of deficient indoor air quality to how we perform. Our bodies are machines, and when we react as machines. Machines like an engine. If you put high octane and good fuel, it reacts. If you put poor octane and you maybe add water and other liquids into it, it just doesn't react as well, and it doesn't perform. So it's the same thing. So I thank you for listening to me. I hope I opened your eyes to the fact that something as simple as ventilation is very critical, whether it's in a home, whether it's in an office building, whether it's in a restaurant, or whether it's within a hospital. Especially today, as we live in this new COVID world, we realize ventilation needs to increase above what we consider code. Code is the absolute minimum. Doubling your ventilation rate becomes very, very easy to do. I know it can get expensive, which is why we use energy recovery ventilation, because energy recovery allows you to be able to rationalize the increased ventilation. Energy recovery using total energy recovery, meaning sensible and latent, will allow you the capacity to increase the ventilation and in turn lower your operating costs if you just maintain the minimum code without energy recovery. So please reach out to us here at RenewAire.com or come visit our website at RenewAire.com, and we could discuss options and what we can do to save you money. Thank you and have a nice day.